Welcome back. We're getting into Trump, Israel, deplatforming, and who in politics is actually authentic. And yeah, J.D. Vance, Ted Cruz, all that weird loyalty politics gets messy fast. It starts with this whole America First thing and immediately turns into a trust exercise. The wild part is how fast Israel became the litmus test on the right. That's the thing, it stops sounding ideological and starts sounding like a loyalty auction. Exactly, like who can shout support the loudest without blinking. The interview's basically saying the right is splitting between America First and Israel First. And that split is not small, it's getting loud. Young people are looking at Gaza and saying, this is not normal, which is honestly the most predictable part of the whole story. Older politicians keep acting like this is some abstract chessboard. But people are seeing bombings on their phones in real time. You can't gaslight a generation that grew up online. That's such a good point because the old playbook relied on distance. If you only hear about war through filtered media, you can sell almost anything. But now the footage lands before the talking points do. And then suddenly questioning it makes you the villain. That label gets thrown like confetti. Bro, literally one sentence and you're exiled. What's interesting is the interview keeps circling back to power, not morality. Like, what does America get from any of this? And that's a very different question than who deserves sympathy. Because once you ask that, the whole empire conversation opens up. And that's where the interview gets uncomfortable. He's basically saying America should support allies only if it helps Americans. Which sounds simple until you start defining help. Exactly, because help can mean anything from peace to oil to shipping lanes. And suddenly the moral language disappears. It becomes spreadsheets with missiles. That is a horrifyingly clean way to put it. But the interview doesn't even pretend the military is just defensive. It's power projection, resource control, all of that. Which is why the trillion-dollar budget debate gets so weird. Because he's not saying cut the military, he's saying use it smarter. That is such a wild sentence to hear casually. Especially when the casual version is like, do we need bases everywhere? And honestly, that's the part normal people understand immediately. Big military, yes, but endless wars, no. That's almost the entire American argument in one sentence. The problem is, the line between defense and empire is basically invisible now. Like, is Ukraine defense or expansion of influence? He says there's a case for Ukraine because Europe's security matters to America. Which is the kind of answer that keeps everyone half happy and half furious. Yeah, it's diplomatic enough to annoy both sides. But then Venezuela comes up and all the restraint evaporates. He basically shrugs at intervention for oil. That's where you hear the empire without the perfume on it. The justification is always the same. They're corrupt. They're aligned with enemies. It's strategic. Which is convenient when you want to sound principled while admitting the motive is resources. And the China comparison is fascinating too. Because China shows up with ports and roads while we show up with drones and sanctions. Different branding, same empire game. That should be on a t-shirt nobody wants to buy. But he argues China's infrastructure is just empire building in disguise. And he's not wrong that infrastructure can be dual use. A port is a port until a navy turns up. That is such a brutal line, but yeah. The bigger point is both countries are acting like global powers, not charities. The only difference is which version looks cleaner on camera. And people keep pretending one side is morally pure. Then the conversation turns to Trump's coalition and whether it survives him. That part is so real because Trump is the product, not the machine. Without him, the whole thing looks way less magnetic. Rubio as the heir is like replacing fireworks with a spreadsheet. Very patriotic spreadsheet, though. Politically devastating insult, honestly. The interview also makes a big deal out of J.D. Vance being manufactured. And that story is kind of hard to unsee once you hear it. He really does read like a person assembled in a lab. A very expensive lab with donor money and nice lighting. The way the interview describes it, Vance was positioned as a translator. A guy who could talk to elites while pretending to be the guy left behind. That's such a strong angle because it explains the polish. He has the energy of a resume with a pulse. That is insanely disrespectful but also fair. The claim is that his authenticity is basically a strategy. He was a Marine, a VC guy, a populist, and somehow all at once. Which is either brilliant politics or total fraud. Probably both, if we're being honest. That's the problem with modern politics. Fraud and talent look identical. And then there's the pivot from anti-Trump to Trump loyalist. That's the detail people never forget. Calling him Hitler and then later calling him Destiny is a journey. A very convenient journey, somehow always heading upward. The interview's point is that he didn't evolve, he recalibrated. And that's why people don't trust these converted populists. Because it feels less like conviction and more like weather tracking. Weather tracking is insane, but yes. The whole segment lands on one theme, which is power always dresses itself up. Whether it's Israel, America First, or Trumpism, there's always a costume. And once you notice the costume, it gets hard to unsee. That's the fun and the curse of this kind of conversation. You start with politics and end up talking about who can be trusted. And honestly, that's the actual story underneath all of it. All right, let's leave it there before we get too deep in the Empire Tunnel. Episode 4 is where this gets even messier. We're getting into the next layer of the power map and the weird stuff around it. Welcome back. This episode is all about power, loyalty, and political reinvention. And yeah, this one gets into how people sell themselves as one thing, then become another, which is honestly politics in its purest form. The wild part is how fast the costume changes once power is on the table. And people act shocked like this is some new invention. Bro, it is the oldest industry on Earth. The modern packaging is just cleaner. Let's get into the part where the story stops being about ideology and starts being about survival. Because that's where the interesting stuff is. Like, who is actually loyal to what, and who is just loyal to winning? That is the entire question. The Israel First versus America First thing is really about hierarchy, right? Like, what happens when a movement says one thing on the poster and does another in practice? That's where everybody starts arguing in circles. And then they pretend the circle is a straight line. Perfect politics, terrible geometry. The thing that jumps out is how the younger crowd is less patient with the old scripts. They hear the same talking points and immediately go, wait, why are we funding this? That pressure is the whole game now. Because the old guard thought they could keep repeating slogans forever. Not when everybody has receipts in their pocket. Once people can compare the speech to the vote, it gets ugly fast. And that leads straight into the Trump angle, because he changed the coalition story. He made people think the party could be one thing while acting like another. Or maybe he just exposed what it already was. Yeah, that's the less flattering version. But it's probably the more honest one. And that's why a lot of people are worried about the post-Trump future. Because once the loudest guy leaves, what exactly is left? A lot of spreadsheets, probably. And way fewer excuses. The J.D. Vance piece is where this gets almost absurd. Because the whole story is basically reinvention stacked on reinvention. He goes from outsider narrative to elite networking to populist heir apparent. That is a very busy resume for somebody pretending to be plain-spoken. Busy and deeply curated. And the funny thing is, that kind of polish makes people trust him less. Because he doesn't feel like he stumbled into power. He feels assembled. That is such a brutal word, but yes. Like someone built him in a lab using donor money and resentment. Honestly, not the worst political origin story we've heard. What makes it interesting is how normal people can smell opportunism instantly, even if they cannot explain it academically. They just know when somebody is selling them a mask. And that's why the reinvention works only if enough people want to believe it. Which means the audience matters as much as the performer. That's the part people miss all the time. They think it is just manipulation from the top, but there's a hunger from below, too. People want a story that makes their chaos feel organized. And politicians are basically in the story-selling business. Which is why a guy can attack Trump one year and crown himself the next. The real scandal is how often that works. Because once a person gets a little institutional permission, people start smoothing over everything before. They go, well, maybe he evolved. Sure, evolved straight into a campaign operation. That's exactly it. And underneath all of this is the huge question of what America First even means in practice. Because once you start talking about military bases, trade routes, and allies, it gets murky fast. People say America First like it's one clean sentence. Then you ask them to define it, and suddenly everybody is studying the ceiling. That ceiling gets a lot of work in political conversations. The issue is that empires do not get to be simple about themselves. They have to justify everything as defense, even when it looks like reach. And that tension is basically running the entire conversation. So yeah, this episode is really about the gap between the label and the machine. That gap is where all the drama lives. All right, let's stay in it and see what falls out. Welcome back. This episode is all about loyalty, reinvention, and who gets to call themselves America first. And honestly, the wild part is how fast those labels become costumes. Because one minute you are anti-establishment, and the next minute you're just wearing a different suit. That is politics in a nutshell, man. What hit me first was how quickly the conversation turns from values to power. Like, do they actually believe this stuff, or are they just riding the wave? In politics, those are annoyingly often the same question. Yeah, and that is exactly why people get so suspicious so fast. The whole Israel, America First tension is interesting because it is not just policy. It is identity, money, donor pressure, and what side of the machine you live on. And once that happens, nobody is debating in good faith anymore. They are mostly picking teams and then pretending it is principle. But the young people pushing back on Gaza, that part feels real to me. It is one of those moments where the base is looking at the leadership and saying, wait, what are we doing? That is a dangerous moment for any coalition, especially when the coalition is held together by slogans and vibes. The weirdest part is how quickly criticism gets translated into betrayal. You question bombing and suddenly you're being dragged into a totally different conversation. The argument skips 5 levels and lands on your character. Exactly, and then nobody remembers what the original issue was. What I keep coming back to is that these factions all claim to be protecting the country, but they disagree on whether protection means restraint or projection. And projection sounds cooler until you pay the bill. Bro, the bill is absolutely the part everybody ignores until it is enormous. The military budget question is where the whole fantasy gets exposed. People hear $1 trillion and think it's obviously the problem. But the deeper argument is that a huge military is not the same as endless war. That sounds neat, but the footprint grows the minute nobody is checking it. Bureaucracies do not naturally choose less of themselves. That is such a brutal sentence, but it is true. And then you get into the empire logic, which is the part people hate hearing out loud. If you believe America is already a global empire, then the whole debate changes. Then it becomes about where you spend force, not whether you have force. Which is a much scarier conversation because it assumes the machine is permanent. And that is exactly why people cling to the simpler story. What did you make of the Venezuela piece? Because that got real fast, like real fast. The moral confidence around oil and regime change is always insane to me. People act like corrupt governments make corruption the only possible tool. But then the reply is basically, geopolitics has no innocence. Which is a lovely sentence if you are not the one getting flattened by it. Right, it is very elegant from a distance. I do think the China comparison matters, though. Because China shows up with ports, rail, and financing, and America shows up with bombs and lectures. Even if both have self-interest, the packaging changes how people experience it. Exactly, and the packaging is politics, too. But the pushback there is important because infrastructure can absolutely be strategy. A port is not just a port if a navy can use it later, which means even the helpful thing can have a second face. That is the whole episode in one sentence, honestly. The J.D. Vance part is where it got almost theatrical. Because the story is not just that he changed, it's that the change looks engineered. And once you start seeing the scaffolding, you cannot unsee it. The resume starts doing way too much emotional labor. That line is criminal but accurate. The issue is not that people evolve because people do evolve. The issue is when the evolution is perfectly aligned with the donor map. Then you are not watching a conversion, you are watching a repositioning. And that is what makes the whole origin story feel like a product launch. A product launch with a working-class accent attached. The Marine part is another place where people get uneasy because service gets used as credibility. And sometimes that credibility is earned, but sometimes it is just packaging. Not every uniform tells you what a person believes. It tells you what outfit they wore on the day. That is actually a perfect line for this whole political era. What I found most revealing is how easily the conversation turns to youth versus age. Like the old guard is just too far gone, and the young people are the ones noticing the scam. There is some truth to that. But young people also get manipulated faster than anyone. Sure, but they also smell stale rhetoric instantly. They know when a speech is just a fossil wearing eyeliner. Fossil-wearing eyeliner is absolutely insane. But that is the vibe with a lot of these rising politicians. They are not really speaking to the future. They are speaking to a machine that wants continuity. And the machine loves a convert because converts are easier to market. Nobody trusts the person who is exactly who they were yesterday, which is tragic but also kind of understandable. On Trump, the big question is whether he can still hold the coalition together without being on the ballot. Because Trump is not just a candidate, he is basically an operating system for that side. And if the operating system leaves, everybody suddenly looks a lot less impressive. Rubio trying to inherit the same magic is a wild thought. Some people can manage policy, but not a crowd's emotional frequency. That is the part people underestimate about populism. It is not just positions, it is the feeling that somebody is still fighting. And if the fight starts looking like donor choreography, people drift. That is probably the biggest takeaway from this whole stretch. The message can survive a lot, but the messenger has to feel real. Fake conviction is still fake even when it is delivered with a flag behind it. That should be on a mug somewhere. All right, we're going to leave it there for this one. That was episode 3, and we got from empire to resume theater without even trying. Next time, we get into what happens when the whole thing starts cracking under its own contradictions. Episode 4 is where the pressure really starts to show.